Carly Fiorina is coming up here on the John Fredericks Radio Network, Trucking the Truth. Your commander of common sense, your Godzilla of the truth in America. Now, just when you thought it was safe to go outside, we got ships going to the Korean Peninsula, warships going, aircraft carriers going. The Russians, they got their destroyers going through the Mediterranean to get near Syria. So a lot of tension going on. Who better to sort this all out for us? Who better in America to bring on and sort this all out than former candidate for president, former candidate for U.S. Senate in California, and likely candidate for U.S. Senate in Virginia, Carly Fiorina. Carly, great to have you with us.
Good morning, John. How are you?
All right. Now, we got a lot to talk about, Carly Fiorina. This just in right now, the White House putting out a statement saying that at this time, this just out, at this time, there's no U.S. intelligence community consensus that Russia had any foreknowledge of the Syrian chemical attack. Any reports, the White House says, to the contrary are false. So just want to put that out there. All right, let's get to Trump's bombing of...
Interesting that they felt the need to say that. That's interesting.
Yes, that just came out 4 minutes ago over the wire from Joseph Cameron, who today is part of the print pool at the White House. So that just out.
My guess is they put that statement out, A, because it's true. They don't have any consensus on it. And B, to try and diffuse tensions ahead of Tillerson's visit to Moscow.
One would think that, right?
Yes, one would.
Okay, so I don't know if the Russians had knowledge of it or not. The White House is saying they didn't. White House...
well, the wording is interesting. No consensus.
Yeah, let me read the exact statement again. At this time, there is no U.S. intelligence community consensus that Russia had foreknowledge of the Syrian chemical attack. Any reports to the contrary are false.
Yeah. Well, I would just say I think that's very cautious and specific language. Mm-hmm. At this time, no consensus. Mm-hmm. And therefore, I think its purpose is to try and diffuse tensions before Tillerson meets with his counterpart in Putin.
All right, so...
And I also believe that the Pentagon continues to investigate this. So I don't think it's a closed issue.
So say the Russians did have knowledge of it and didn't do anything to stop it. What changes?
Well, first, I think Tillerson and Trump both said what is indisputably true. Either the Russians were aware that there were chemical weapons left in Syria, which the Syrian government had possession of, which means that either they were aware that the agreement was not fulfilled with the Obama administration, as the Syrians and the Russians claimed, or the agreement was not executed in a competent way, and so there was stuff left lying around. I mean, I just think that's indisputable. I never thought the agreement that the Obama administration made was going to be effective because it was not verifiable. And because you had two bad actors, Russia and Syria, saying, no, trust us, we gave everything to you. And they're not worthy of trust, either party. So to me, it's not a surprise that there were chemical weapons lying around, but I think it was also appropriate for Tillerson and Trump to make the point that, hey, Russia, you said you could broker this deal. Either you knew you didn't broker it effectively or you were incompetent in the brokering of it. I'm sure that raised tensions ahead of Tillerson's trip. And so this may be a way of trying to diffuse those tensions so they can have a hopefully reasonable conversation.
Carly Fiorina, why has there been no media attention to the fact that you just mentioned that the Russian Federation agreed to broker the negotiation and the compromise to get rid of the chemical weapons after the last attack, and now there's another chemical weapon attack? I mean, have you seen this anywhere in any part of any mainstream media like it didn't even happen?
Well, the media has a very short memory, as we know. The media also, the media is never good at recalling history. And, of course, history is very important, particularly in this part of the world, where conflicts that rage in the Middle East have their genesis 1,000 years ago. History is everything in this part of the world. And so to ignore history is to ignore all of the facts and nuances of the situation. I have to say, though, John, I do think the media has been, surprisingly to me, has been quite forthcoming in reminding people that the Obama administration really failed in so many ways in the handling of Syria, that because of their failure, they handed President Trump a very, very difficult situation where the facts, you and I have talked about this before, the facts on the ground in 2017 are so much worse than the facts on the ground in 2012 or 2013 or even 2015 and 16. So I think they've been reasonably good about that. There's no question Russia is a bad actor in this region. And my hope is that President Trump understands that now in a way that perhaps he did not. Recall that during his campaign, he was very much in support of Russia's involvement in the region. I have opposed it always because Russia is up to no good. There's just no question. So I hope that President Trump now has seen in the course of this that Russia is there now. They're entrenched there. They're no doubt helping Russia and Iran. They are no doubt solidifying those regimes, and those regimes are not healthy for the region, and they are not pro-American in any way.
Carly, would you say what you just outlined was one of the things that you said on the campaign trail for president multiple times? Do you feel that you're vindicated now with the position that you had back then?
Oh, I'm not. Hey, I didn't bring it up for that reason. I'm not looking for vindication in any way. I just think having been in and around the world for a long time, and in the Middle East for a long time, and in Russia, I think there are certain things that are just indisputably true. It is indisputably true that Russia is not our friend. That's indisputably true. It is indisputably true that Vladimir Putin seeks to undermine and weaken the United States, certain European institutions. It is indisputably true that Russia is supporting our enemies in the region, most specifically Iran, but Syria as well, both of which countries are destabilizing forces in the Middle East. They are supporters of terrorism in the Middle East, and Russia is a supporter of them. So it is, I find it hard to believe when Russia and Syria say, we are fighting ISIS. Yes, they are fighting ISIS because ISIS is fighting them, different religious branches of Islam, etc. But on the other hand, they have funded terrorists. So terrorism, they have no problem with. They just want it to be their terrorists. And so we have to separate our strategy from Russia one way or another. And that's why Tillerson's meeting is going to be very tense. Perhaps that's the reason for this relatively simple communique, to try and diffuse some of that tension. But the United States of America has to be seen as a leader and a stabilizing force in the Middle East, and we will not be seen if we allow Russia to do whatever they want to do in the Middle East, which unfortunately was what I thought Trump was suggesting during the campaign, and what I hope now he understands is not the appropriate strategy.
So, Carly, do you agree with President Trump's missile attack on Thursday of that one airfield or not, and why?
I do actually agree. And I know one missile attack is not a strategy, but I think there are certain times when a provocation to the United States is so clear that a response is necessary. You cannot say that we struck this airport because of the human tragedy that is Syria. I mean, my goodness, that human tragedy has been going on for years and years. Hundreds upon hundreds of thousands of people have been slaughtered by the Syrian government with Russian help and Iranian help, and millions are displaced. So you cannot say we're doing this because of the human cost. But you can say, as President Trump did say, I thought very eloquently, it is in the United States' interest to draw a line and say we will not permit the use of chemical weapons. I thought the provocation had to be answered, and it was.
All right, so where do we go from here? Trump, before the missile attack and what happened with the chemical weapons, the administration's position was, we can go forward with Assad, let them figure it out. We're not going to get involved in regime change. Now it appears, based on what Sean Spicer said yesterday at the presser, was that, Assad has to go if you're going to get any stabilization in the country. So here's my question. Does Assad have to go, and are you in favor of getting us further involved in order to initiate a regime change in Syria?
I am not in favor of us getting involved in regime change. I think Trump had that right. I also think in the world there are certain times when ambiguity is helpful. I think Obama made a huge mistake, not just when he let the red line be crossed. He made a huge mistake by declaring over and over and over, Assad has to go. On the other hand, I think the Trump administration made a mistake when they declared, we don't really care if he goes or stays. I think on this issue, ambiguity is helpful. To use President Trump's term, unpredictability is helpful. So I would advise the administration, quit talking about Assad. We're not going to put ground troops in there for regime change. I mean, let's hope we're not. But I do think now a little bit of unpredictability, which Donald Trump promised, would be hugely helpful. It was unpredictable and therefore very effective when Trump fired that missile launch. I think we should stop talking about Assad. But now I think we need to lean really hard on Russia, which presumably is what Tillerson is over there to do. And I think recall that we have some leverage over Iran. We have lifted a whole regime of sanctions, big mistake. We have the whole nuclear deal that Trump has promised to relook at. That deal should never have been struck. It now needs to be ripped up. So let's focus on the supporters of Assad, where I think we have leverage. And if Assad continues to use chemical weapons, then the United States will have to respond.
All right, that makes a lot of sense to me. Carly, when you look at the Assad chemical attack and you look at the fact that they were winning the war with the help of the Russians, we had already said 3 days earlier, you know what, we're not going to get involved. A lot of people on our show have said, what in the world was the strategic incentive for Assad to launch this chemical attack when he knew it was going to have a worldwide backlash when things were going his way? How do you see that? What was the objective of Assad? And because now we seem to have intel. I mean, we've had enough congressmen on our show that have said that they've seen intelligence that it's clearly the attack came from the Assad regime, not from ISIS. So what was their objective?
I don't think there's any doubt that it did.
Right.
Use their airplanes, for heaven's sakes,
right,
and Russian drones, etc. Honestly, I'm not sure I have any capacity to get inside Assad's head, but I would just say, to me, there are two possible explanations. One, human nature being what it is. You know how often people just go one step too far? People do that all the time. We just talked about a governor in Alabama who did that. I mean, when people are feeling flush with victory, that's when people tend to make mistakes and go one step too far. So it could be as simple as, people had the scent of victory and said, okay, let's finish this thing off. And it's not irrational for Assad to assume, look, nobody's ever done anything about this before. Trump told us he's not going to do anything about this. Let's go get it done. That's not irrational given all the signals that had been sent. The second explanation I have is that they were trying to send a message. They were trying to send a message to their enemies, perhaps ISIS, perhaps others. Watch out. We have chemical weapons. We have no compunction about absolute brutality. So understand who you're dealing with.
I think the former explanation you just gave is most likely spot on. Carly, let's get to foreign policy. In Asia, President Trump yesterday deploying several carriers to the Korean Peninsula and asking his generals to draw up a plan in case we need to strike North Korea. So 2 questions here. The first is, where are we going with this? Why are we sending our carriers into the region, which obviously makes China a little edgy? And secondly, if you were president, you would certainly ask your generals for contingency plans. How does that get leaked to the media?
Well, first, I think sending carrier groups and other equipment into the peninsulas or into the area is appropriate. We also are either just completed or still in the process of conducting joint military exercises with the South Koreans, which we do a couple times a year. That is going on or has just finished. And that all of that is a strong and important and necessary signal to North Korea. North Korea clearly continues to barrel towards a device capable of hitting the United States. We cannot permit that to happen. China understands that. And so we're sending a very strong message. China ought to be nervous. I think the intent is to make them nervous because, like Iran with Syria, China has enormous leverage over North Korea. They are not using that leverage, although they have been doing more lately. I mean, they have banned some exports from North Korea into China as a retaliation to the previous missile test. That's good, but we need them to do more. And I think the impact of President Trump's unpredictable missile attack in Syria is to send a message to Kim Jong-un as well, to say, don't think you can just carry on here with impunity, and I think that's a good thing.
Okay, so let's get back to the leak, though. I mean, how does this get leaked out?
Well, I think there are leaks that are not intended to come out, and then, of course, as you well know, there are many, many, many so-called leaks in Washington, D.C. that are very purposeful. And my guess is this was a very purposeful leak. That, again, a signal is being sent. A signal is being sent to North Korea. A signal is also being sent to China, with whom, as you just mentioned, Trump just completed a summit. So I think they want this out there, and I think it's helpful it's out there.
Let's get to the Chinese summit that he had in Mar-a-Lago. Now, of course, the optics of it, he's having dinner with the Chinese premier and his wife. He excuses himself, perhaps said he has to go to the bathroom, gets on TV, and says there's going to be a missile attack, explains why, and then goes back to dinner. So the optics of that are pretty interesting. I'm not sure they timed it that way when it started out, but it worked out to certainly send a message. Where are the Chinese here involved in the North Korean situation? They know they're dealing with a madman, but yet they prop up his government. And a lot of people think you've got to really pressure the Chinese to get anything done there, but they never seem to do anything. So tie this all in for us, Carly.
Well, I actually think the optics were fantastic.
Right.
I think, again, the unpredictability, I think sometimes unpredictability is a real problem. But in this case, I think the unpredictable nature of President Trump's last few days of last week with the Chinese were very helpful. The fact that China did not know this was coming, the fact that Trump didn't check with them, the fact that he went ahead and did what he had to do as President of the United States and Commander-in-Chief, despite the fact that he had a Chinese president there, I think all that is good. Because what it says to China is, new sheriff in town, we are going to do what we think is necessary to protect our interests, and we're not checking with you, and we're not checking with you in Asia necessarily either. That is precisely the way the Chinese have been behaving. They've commandeered basically the disputed islands. They are in Asia. They are trying to control the trade route there, through which flow literally trillions and trillions of dollars worth of goods every year. We cannot permit them to do that. And so I think that was a very, very clear signal and a necessary signal. China loves to maintain a balance of power. North Korea, yes, they know they have a madman, but they also know they have an ally and a state that is almost entirely dependent upon them for economic support, and that state keeps others in East Asia in particular in line. And they like that. And so I think the calculus here for us must be to ratchet up the pressure on China until North Korea as an ally is no longer a net positive for them. Right now, for a long time, North Korea has been a net positive for China in the region as a way of exerting power and keeping others off balance, and we need to change that equation, and I think the Trump administration is in the process of doing that.
Okay, so that makes sense. So what you're saying, if I can paraphrase it, is as long as the status quo with North Korea continues to be an asset for Chinese aims, then they're going to do nothing to alter the situation. So you're saying
that's right.
What the U.S. has to do is change the math, if you will, change the equation so that North Korea starts to become a liability to the Chinese instead of an asset.
That's right. And if we have, battle groups and carriers in and around the region, that starts to change the calculus quickly.
Exactly. Okay, we are with Carly Fiorina. Carly, what is the level in your mind of real threat from the North Korean government to the United States?
Well, I think it's real. I think it's a real threat for two reasons. One, because clearly their nuclear capability is now, according to the experts, further along than we might have thought. Secondly, I think it's real because this seems to be Kim Jong-un's number one objective. He has decided that the projection of his national success, of his leadership, the single most important way to project his leadership and success is a successful nuclear program. And so it doesn't matter that millions of his people are starving. I mean, nothing else matters other than getting this done. And so I think the threat is real, and we cannot permit him to finish that program. And that's why it makes total sense to have General Mattis drawing up plans. It makes sense to send signals to that regime, and it makes sense to change China's calculus. What I worry about is Kim Jong-un is clearly, as you say, I mean, a madman. He's young. He's relatively inexperienced. This is a guy who could get provoked very easily. And so I'm sure they are thinking about that as well.
Well, look, Carly Fiorina, this is a young man that goes around and murders all of his family members out of paranoia. This is a man that one of his top generals, at a speech he made, I guess he was up the prior night late, he just dozed off. I mean, it happens to people in the middle of the day. He's in the sun. He dozed off for a minute, and he had him executed with an anti-aircraft gun, which, if you're familiar with that, that basically means your body is blown in about 1,000 pieces. So this guy's not stable, right? No one behaves this way. And you look at the number of executions there. I mean, he had a band that was going around, and he decided he didn't like the band, and he just lined them up in a wall and shot them all. You never know what this guy's going to do in any moment, right?
Yeah. In earlier times, much earlier times, all of that would have been par for the course. You know, you read history about Genghis Khan and people in that part of the world, or elsewhere, by the way. We're not used to this level of brutality designed to maintain power, but it's certainly not unprecedented. I would argue, for those who get confused about Russia, I mean, yes, everything you said about Kim Jong-un is absolutely right. And Vladimir Putin has knocked off probably as many people, but he's done it in a far more subtle fashion because he's a former KGB agent. My point is this. The fact that Kim Jong-un is unbelievably brutal, that he is consolidating power through brutality and execution, does not, to me, mean he is irrational. Power is all he has, and that's why I think we have to be very clear-eyed when we deal with him.
All right, let's get to AUMF, Carly Fiorina, who was with us. Many of those in Congress are saying, look, the existing authorization for military force agreement that we're using now was put in place 3 presidents ago in 2000. And so 3 administrations later, and we're still going by it. Do you believe that any deployment of U.S. troops anywhere needs Trump to come to Congress and get authorization for AUMF or not?
Well, I don't think a missile strike does. But I do think that continuing to operate under this AUMF is a nice fig leaf so nobody has to make a tough decision.
Right.
It's ridiculous that we're still operating under this AUMF. So, yes, the commander-in-chief has wide latitude, and I don't agree with those who say he needed Congress's approval to launch a missile strike.
Right.
But he certainly does need Congress and the American people at the right time to understand what his strategy is. Mm-hmm. And if he's deploying troops, absolutely.
Okay, so
we need a new authorization, and Congress needs to be involved.
Right, and then you have to make the argument, right? I mean, you have to go to Congress,
absolutely,
and you have to make the argument.
And then members of Congress have to make a tough decision.
Exactly.
And be on record.
Exactly. You are so right there. The reason it's been avoided and not brought up in Congress to even require it is because people can hide behind it.
That's right. And remember, not that I'm in the business of defending Obama, but you will remember back to history for a moment. Obama went to Congress in terms of his Syria strategy,
right,
and said, I want Congress to weigh in here. Now, some would argue he didn't need that. That was a fig leaf for him. But the point is, Congress punted. They didn't want to deal with that issue,
right.
So they didn't.
No, you're right. I mean, that's exactly it right there. So this is really on Congress. So you have many Congress people asking for this. And, of course, if you do run for the U.S. Senate, this has been one of the staples of Democratic from Virginia senators. Senator Tim Kaine has been arguing for this for some time. So if you are squared off with him, I guess this could be one area you might actually agree on. Carly Fiorina, let's get to this palace intrigue that is dogging the Trump administration. Look, you ran for president. You could have won, been in there now. Steve Bannon and Jared Kushner and Ryan Priebus and these leaks that come out and this infighting. What is going on there, and is it a distraction, or is it just, in your mind, par for the course?
Well, I do think Washington loves to obsess about palace intrigue. I mean, it's just sort of the town runs on power. And so, of course, people are going to gossip about who has it and who doesn't all the time. Some of this is par for the course. On the other hand, the piece that I think is not par for the course and will become a problem, may already be one, is there clearly is not a clear chain of command in the White House. In other words, people are not really sure who's in charge of what issue. And I think that is a problem over time. President Trump is obviously an individual who is comfortable hearing many, many different points of view before he makes a decision.
Right.
I think that's a plus in many ways. But ultimately, people who work for him need to understand who speaks for him and who is in charge of teeing up the decisions for him. And I think that's unclear right now. The second thing that I would say is these are people, let's just talk about Bannon and Kushner for a moment. They have entirely different points of view. entirely different points of view, political points of view, about what it is the administration should be doing. So honestly, I know Jared Kushner and Ivanka Trump are very, very accomplished people. They obviously have the trust of their father. But their opinions, their points of view are quite different from Bannon's and in many cases Reitz's. And so now you have not just lack of clarity about who's in charge underneath the president, but you have lack of clarity about what policies are being pursued. And I think ultimately that is more troubling, and eventually I think will have to be resolved one way or another.
All right, so Curly, you would agree with me, which has been what I've been saying for a couple of weeks here, that the Trump management executive philosophy, which proved very successful for our president in building back a $10 billion company from the ashes he had from what happened in Atlantic City with those casinos. The management strategy of, I'm going to create several different fiefdoms and we'll let the best ideas battle it out. And at the end of the day, the best idea is going to win and that person is going to get promoted. I mean, that basically is how he ran the company and got the best ideas. I think if you try to do that in government, as you said, I agree with you 100%, you have divergent ideologies. So it's not like, well, let's get the best ideology to come out of it. You can't have that. As you said, you have very different points of view, different political philosophies. I mean, it's like if you get to trade, right? Ideologically, I am a lifelong protectionist. And then you got other people who are free traders. There's not a lot of compromise there. I mean, either you're going to put a tariff or you're not. And I guess you could argue, is a tariff 10% or 25%? You could do that if all the people were in favor of import tariffs like I am. But if you have a free trader and a protectionist and they have different ideas and ideologies, how does that work? I mean, I think you're onto something. I really think that's the issue. Am I right?
This is why principles matter. Governing philosophy matters.
Right.
What is the governing philosophy? What are the principles by which you are going to govern? That shouldn't be a free-for-all. Another example of what you're talking about, I personally was quite disturbed to read that Ivanka Trump met with the head of Planned Parenthood. There's no doubt we should be on a mission to defund from taxpayer funding Planned Parenthood.
Yes.
Just set aside for a moment the evils of abortion. Planned Parenthood is a political organization.
Right.
They gave out over $30 million all to Democratic candidates last year. Why should taxpayers be funding that? So when in the middle of trying to get Planned Parenthood defunded and hopefully finally getting the Pain-Capable Unborn Child Protection Act passed, which bans abortion after 5 months, why would you be inviting the president of Planned Parenthood into the White House? That's an incredibly confusing signal that speaks to underlying principles and philosophy. That, I think, is going to have to get resolved.
You know what? You took the words out of my mouth. I thought you talked about optics earlier and the great optics of the president having dinner with the president of China and then launching the missile attack going on TV. Optics could have been better. I thought the optics of Ivanka meeting with Seal, what's her name, Seal Richards?
That's her name.
Parenthood, Seal Richards. And, you know, her history is not pleasant in this battle. If you're pro-life like we are, she has an unpleasant history. And some of the things that she sanctioned in there, for the life of me, I didn't know what was going on with that, how that made any sense. And, you know, she has a right to, look, I'm a friend of Ivanka's. I know what she stands for. She's got that right. But I think if you're representing the president of the United States, who is staunchly pro-life, and he's proven that, I just don't know what the purpose of that meeting was.
Yeah.
I really don't. So with you on that. I've only got a minute. If you were advising the president right now, what would be your next move on the domestic legislative front? Where can he have a win?
He needs to get tax reform done. He needs to get tax reform done. Yes, they can continue to work quietly behind the scenes on health care, as you and I talked about last time I was with you. They need to not give up on that, but they need to quit talking about it and take the time and do it right. And when they're ready with health care, go out and explain to the American people why it's going to be better for them than where we are right now. But in the meantime, they've got to get tax reform done. Now, a lot of people would say, go do infrastructure next, and maybe you can get some bipartisan support, but the time is running out now to get tax reform done, and there is no single more powerful jolt to the economy right now than tax reform. They got to get that done.
All right, that's going to be the final word. Carly, thank you for staying that extra segment. It was so insightful. Great to have you on. And I really appreciate it. Carly Fiorina, you can follow her. You can find her at carlyfiorina.com. Follow her on Twitter at Carly Fiorina. And I believe she's going to run for U.S. Senate in 2018. And quite frankly, it's going to be Tim Kaine's worst nightmare ever. Carly, thanks for being
John,
with
for
us.
having me, and happy Easter to you and all your listeners.
Happy Easter to you also. Keep it right here.